Yeah. I have a friend that she was Wiccan, and then she um, married a Christian guy. And so now she's kind of, I mean, she believes in Christ, but she still kind of does some of the Wiccan stuff.
Okay.
So, I mean, it's not like she's trying to cast spells or anything, but a lot of the herbal,
Yeah.
yeah. So, okay,
Are there any kind of, this might be like a silly question, but are there any kind of like Christian Wiccan or Christian pagans?
Christian pagans? Um,
You don't really hear like, you usually hear like the, I guess the Satanists or the Wiccans.
right.
Are the most common, I guess.
I think as far as, I guess it depends on how you define a Christian. Um, I think a lot of people that only come on, say, Christmas and Easter, or maybe they come to church every Sunday, but they just sort of sit there and do nothing.
Right. They're not active.
Right, they're not really active. And then you have the cults, which could be considered pagan because they're not worshiping the one true God.
Right.
They're worshiping either three separate gods or
gods and goddesses.
Yeah. So that could be considered Christian pagan. I don't know of any Christians that would say sacrifice animals or anything like some of the more extreme pagans would. Um, I could see maybe someone in Baha'i, since Baha'i is all 9 major religions combined.
Okay.
I could see someone who leans towards Christianity but is Baha'i maybe being a pagan type because they still have Hinduism and Buddhism and stuff in there too.
Huh.
So,
yeah. Because the other conversation we're having, I'm kind of made me think of Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code.
Mm-hmm.
So, and there's so many Christians that are very judgmental about it, but it's a fiction story.
Yeah.
And yes, he uses, what I like about it is he uses, it's like a historical fiction. So that's kind of like what I like about it, is because he uses real things, but it's a real story. But I also like historical nonfiction as well. But it's just,
Yeah, I think he does say in his preface that it's fiction, right?
right, yeah,
But nobody reads that, and so they read it and they think it's actual like study and research and history.
yeah, because it's using real facts.
Right.
Yeah,
except for the whole Jesus had a wife thing, but
yeah,
it was good entertainment.
yeah,
I didn't like it otherwise, but it was good entertainment.
yeah,
Well, it's like Noah. Noah was good entertainment, but it wasn't biblical.
yeah, and that was no, yeah, I didn't like that. That one I could say I didn't like.
Yeah.
Because it was just like with Noah, and I said like the trailer to it. It was just like I'm expecting like again like historical nonfiction, and the way I saw it was just like Transformers and Bible that come together.
Right.
And that's the way because it was like those rock forms.
The golems.
Yeah.
Where the angels fell, they got in the mud and became the golems.
Yeah.
That's actually part of Kabbalah mythology. But yeah, I could see where the Transformers meets the Bible comes into play.
Yeah.
And then Noah caring more about the animals than his own family.
Yeah.
And not wanting his family to have kids. Yeah, no.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. Okay, I wasn't frozen. I was just listening. And it's lagging behind. Well, do you want to get started? I guess.
Sure.
Since no one else is here. Oh. Okay. So not that you have to, but did you do any reading and have any questions that might come up during the presentation, or?
I do not.
Okay, so that's fine. I don't care. I know the one guy asked, and was like, if you want to read, you can. Might have some questions. If not,
yeah.
And if something comes up, I can answer it now. So, okay. So Genesis 12 through 50 is a pretty large chunk of history, but it all deals with Abraham and his descendants down to about the 4th generation, maybe the 5th, but they don't really mention them that much. And that's what we're going to be going over. Let me get my mouse to work. There we go. I did want to do a bit of an introduction to Genesis. I don't remember how much of an introduction to Genesis itself I did, other than it's a book of beginnings.
Yeah.
So a little bit about who wrote it and that. Moses, I believe, is the one who wrote it, but he was more of an editor than a writer. He took a lot of the stories that had been handed down through the Jewish peoples and through the guidance of the Holy Spirit, put them together and made sure everything was good, of course. I don't even if you believe it's allegory, I still think it's what God wanted in there and it's truthful in at least some sense. Um, so conservatively, Moses did that around 1440 BC, which would have been shortly after the Exodus, before they went into the land of Canaan. Of course, Moses didn't make it into the land of Canaan, but we'll talk about that in Exodus when that comes up.
Okay. And it's the way it goes, it's Genesis then Exodus, right?
Yeah.
And the way you're saying it sounds like it's Exodus really came first in Genesis.
Yeah. So, well, the events of Exodus took place, and then I think they were wandering around the wilderness for 40 years, right?
Mhm.
I'm guessing, I can't substantiate this, but I'm guessing that 40 years is when Moses wrote it down, because it would have had to be, he wouldn't have had time to write anything down while he was talking to Pharaoh, and then while he was leading them out of Egypt up until after they finally got away from Pharaoh's armies. And he couldn't have written it after he died, and he died before they entered the Promised Land because of the wickedness of the generation that didn't want to go into the Promised Land.
Yeah.
So the events of Exodus took place, and then Moses, maybe he wrote Exodus first, but he still would have had all these stories that took place before the Exodus that he would have combined and edited. Yeah.
Okay.
So Genesis is from creation to when Israel moves into Egypt, which would be Joseph and his story. Um, and that all took place at least 200 years, if not 400 years before Moses came around. It depends on how you calculate the 400 years they were in not in their own land. Some say it was like 200 and some odd in Canaan, and then 200 and some odd in Egypt. Some say it was all 400 in Egypt because it was all slavery. So that just kind of depends on that. Another book I wanted to introduce, it's not in the list of books we're going to go over as far as the redemptive story, but I do want to tell everyone about all the books a little bit, and that's the book of Job. Um, Chronologically speaking, the events of Job probably took place either slightly before Abraham or slightly after, maybe even during. Um, Definitely before Moses, because in the book of Job, there's no mention of Yahweh. There's mention of God Almighty, and that's obviously Yahweh, but the name Yahweh isn't used. And the Mosaic law is never brought up in Job. He still makes sacrifices and stuff, so apparently there was something that God told everybody that knew there were going to be sacrifices, but there's no Mosaic law.
Okay, so kind of like pretenses.
Yeah. So some people think that Job is also allegorical. I think it's historical, just because it reads as history.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure in ancient times how much historical fiction was being written, you know.
Yeah.
Or just, yeah. So that is that. So let's get into Abraham. So his name originally was Abram, which I don't know if I put what that means in here or not. I think I did. But he was the 7 times great grandson of Noah, according to those genealogies that most people skip over.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I did have some verses that we were going to read. So I'll flip to those. If you want to pull out your phone, you can. So Genesis 12, 1 to 3. It says, The Lord said to Abram, Go out from your land, your relatives, and your father's house, to the land that I will show you. I will make you into a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse those who treat you with contempt. And all the peoples on earth will be blessed through you. And so Abram took his wife and his nephew, and he left. And I got a map on the next slide to kind of show you where they went. And then Genesis 12:7. But the Lord appeared to Abram and said, I will give this land to your offspring. So he built an altar there to the Lord who appeared to him. And that's after he moves down into the land of Canaan. Later, God shows up again and he says, look around, and reiterates the promise, this is the land I'm going to give to you and your descendants.
And this is all taking place before he tells Noah to build the ark.
No, this was after.
After, okay.
Yeah. So we have creation and Adam and Eve, then Cain and Abel, and Cain kills Abel, and then Seth is born to Adam and Eve, they have other kids. You got the genealogies. Noah is the eighth from Adam. Um, the flood comes. Him and his wife, his three sons, and their three wives all survive in the ark with the animals. And then this is about 7 generations after Noah.
Okay.
So this would be after the Tower of Babel, um, probably 300 or 400 years, I think. I'll have to look at that up. But at least a few generations. And the generations were still pretty long back then because they were still living for quite a while after the flood, according to the Bible anyway.
Okay.
If it's allegorical, who knows? So, so Abram did travel down into Canaan, and then he went into Egypt. He told his wife, whose name was originally Sarai, to say that she was his sister, which technically she was his half sister. A little creepy, but.
So Sarah was his wife and his half sister.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he wanted her to just say that she was his sister because she was a beautiful woman, and he didn't want to get killed by somebody so that they could have her if they knew he was the husband, you know.
Okay.
Pharaoh actually takes her into his harem. He almost gets into trouble. God stops him from doing anything and says that that woman is married. And then he tells, he gets mad at Abram, why did you tell me that she was your sister? And here, take all this and go, pretty much. And then they go back to Canaan. And that's where this map comes in. So over on the right-hand side, that's where they started with Abram's father, Terah, and his brothers that he had, Nahor and Haran, I think. And then they go up to Haran.
Is it Haran by its name? Or was that there before?
That might have been there before. There were several people that had very similar, if not the same name. So, and I think his brother's name was Haran. I could be wrong. Let me look that up real quick. Yep, Haran, I was right. So, and maybe the city Haran was named after Haran, or maybe it was named after another Haran. But, and then Haran is where God tells Abram to leave again, and that's where he takes his wife and his nephew Lot, and they go down into Shechem. Got a bunch of names there. They're kind of hard to read. They're so close, but yeah. So he travels around there for a little bit. Then he goes into Egypt, which is where Zoan is, and then he goes back into Canaan after Pharaoh kicks him out. So at this point, Abram and Lot were both pretty well blessed by God, and their herds were large, and they had a lot of herdsmen to help them with them. And Abram says, this one area of land we're in is a little too big for both of us, or we're too big for it. There we go. So he says, look, either way, decide which piece of land you want. If you go left, I'll go right. If you go right, I'll go left. So Lot looks over and he sees the Jordan Valley, which is where the Jordan River is. And it's, at that time anyway, it's well watered, it's luscious, and so he decides to go over that way. And Abram goes the other way. And that's where Yahweh comes back and says, okay, look around, look in all directions. This is the land I'm going to give you and your descendants. Now, Lot, the area he went to was the area of Sodom and Gomorrah, and he ends up living in Sodom for a while. And he does get captured. Abram, same person. Abram goes to save Lot after he gets some men together. Some of the kings in the area side with him. Other kings in the area are the ones that captured Lot, and they fight. And he ends up winning and getting Lot back and some spoils of war too. And I don't want to go there just yet. As he's coming back, the king of Sodom kind of stops him, but he defers to the king of Salem, which is ancient Jerusalem. And his name was Melchizedek. Abraham tithes a tenth of all the spoils to him. Abraham didn't keep anything except for what his men had already eaten or taken or whatever. But he didn't want anyone to be able to say that they had made Abraham great. He wanted that to be for God only.
Mm-hmm.
So Some stuff we can learn from Abram and Lot that I put down. Yahweh will bless us despite our shortcomings. Abram lied about his wife. Um, I don't think anything else has come up just yet as far as his character is concerned. Um, but he's
That's
still.
why he gets changed, because he's the liar.
Yeah. I thought I put it in here. Maybe when his name changes. But I know his name becomes the father of many nations, which is Abraham.
Yeah.
And then Sarai becomes Sarah. I forget what her name means off the top of my head. I should have practiced this more.
Is she the one that is that Sarah that was the one that considered is it Sarah? From I don't know if you're familiar with the red tent.
Mm-hmm.
In there is it was face for Sarah. But I don't know, I can't remember now. But it's Sarah's just jumping out at me. But I don't think I think it is, but I'm not positive.
Okay. Let's see. I think she'll come up a little bit later too. So something else. The grass does not always make a place wholesome, right? Because Lot went to where it was green, and it's always greener on the other side, right? Well, but the people in the land that Lot went to were rather wicked people.
Just it was greener on the other side.
Right. If it looks greener, look again. And then take care of those whom you love, because Abram went and saved Lot. He didn't have to, but he did. He was a nephew. So, and then here we come to Melchizedek, the king of Salem. So Melchizedek in Hebrew means my king is righteous or righteousness. Um, some people will translate it righteous king or king of righteousness. I think either is probably good. The Hebrew that I remember, my king is righteous, is probably the better one. And he was the king of Salem, which is the old name for Jerusalem, but it could also be king of peace. Shalom is peace, and the letter for S and Sh, or one of them anyway, is the same letter, but it has different dots depending on which it actually is. So we know he didn't worship any Canaanite deities. He worshipped the God Most High. He was a king priest, which is weird. Normally you can be a king and a prophet, or a priest and a prophet, but you can't be a king and a priest. At least not.
Yeah, is that just in the Jewish religion or faith, or is it just like pretty much all over?
That's pretty much just in the Jewish tradition, the Mosaic Law, which this was before the Mosaic Law, so I suppose it's quite possible that he could have been a king priest. I don't know if there's any priests or kings today that try to claim both. I don't think so, because that would give them a lot of power. I'm sure they would like it.
Yeah, that's probably didn't have it because it's either you're one or the other, and you only have one.
Right, have some sort of checks and balances, right?
Yeah.
So, but he had both. There's no biological or genealogical information given about Melchizedek, at least if his name is Melchizedek. And he had a pretty high position because the king of Sodom deferred to him, and Abram tithed to him. So there is, in the New Testament in Hebrews, it talks about Melchizedek. If you want to look that up, you can. It compares him, it says that Jesus is a priest in the order of Melchizedek, and he's like Melchizedek because Melchizedek didn't have a mother or a father, and he's a priest forever, and that, Christ, technically, the Spirit made a body for him and put it in Mary, so he doesn't really have a father and mother, and he lives forever, he's a priest forever.
Is that how he gets to be so high, since he's kind of like the lack of a way of putting it, almost like a Virgin Mary, somebody from like the Virgin Mary?
Maybe. I think because there is a Jewish tradition about who Melchizedek is, and if it's true, then he probably got to such a high position because he's lived so long. Because the Jewish tradition, which, disclaimer, it is a tradition, it's not in the Bible, it's interesting, but I'm not sure if it's totally true or not, and I'm not sure how I feel about it. But if you look at the genealogies, Melchizedek is actually Shem, And if it makes sense with the genealogies, I have the this slide here. You can see the top one is Shem, and he lives for 600 years, and that bar represents 600 years. And then you have his kids and his kids and his kids. You get down to the last three, which are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
Oh, Jacob was the liar.
Yeah, Jacob was a liar. But if you look, Shem's life ends after Jacob is born. And I think one of the things I saw, like it was 110 years after Isaac was born that Shem died. So Shem theoretically could have known Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he could have been the king of Salem. He could have had that area after the flood and after they split off from Babel and everything. I'm not going to say 100% that it's true. I'm not going to be dogmatic about it. I still don't know how I feel about it, but it's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
And it is Jewish tradition, and even though they got the Messiah wrong, the people back then still kind of knew some stuff, I would think. So, but let's go to the Abrahamic covenant. I should just keep my Bible open. So Genesis 15, 1 through 5. So after these events, after Abram went and rescued Lot and talked to Melchizedek, after these events, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Do not be afraid, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward will be very great. But Abram said, Lord God, what can you give me since I am childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus? Abram continued, Look, you have given me no offspring, so a slave born in my house will be my heir. Now the word of the Lord came to him, This one will not be your heir. Instead, one who comes from your own body will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look at the sky and count the stars, if you are able to count them. Then he said to him, Your offspring will be that numerous.
Is this where he uses it? I'm not sure if there's many Abrams. Is he the one that used his maid?
Yeah, his wife's Egyptian maid.
Yeah.
Yep.
As
and that's where
the childbearer.
Yeah, and that's where Ishmael comes from, but Ishmael is not the promised son. So, good memory. So here we have the promised son. There is a sacrifice talked about in verses like 10 through 12, where he takes some animals, he cuts them in half, lays them down. He doesn't cut the birds in half, he just puts a bird on either side. And then Yahweh, or the Spirit of Yahweh, walks between them, showing the covenant. And then later on, in 13 to 16.
Is it still 15?
Yeah, still chapter 15, verses 13 to 16. God tells Abraham that his offspring are going to be enslaved for 400 years. Not something I would like hearing, but.
No. Is that because he used the slave to
I don't think it's necessarily a punishment. I think it's just something that happened and God telling him it's going to happen. Because later on, towards the end of our lesson here, we'll see that the Pharaoh that enslaved the Hebrews didn't know Joseph, and Joseph had a very high position in Egypt. He was the second, only Pharaoh was above Joseph in Egypt. But then Joseph dies, and after a while they kind of lose their memory about what happened, and so then they enslaved the Israelites. So.
Okay. Was that Abram too, or that he wanted to sacrifice? He wanted to have Abram sacrifice his son.
Isaac. Yep. That comes up in I think chapter 20-ish. 22. That's where God asks Abraham to sacrifice him. So, let's see. So Genesis 16, 1 through 6. Abram's wife Sarai had not borne him children. She owned an Egyptian slave named Hagar. Sarai said to Abram, "Since the Lord has prevented me from bearing children, go to my slave, perhaps I can have children by her." And Abram agreed to what Sarai said. So Abram's wife Sarai took Hagar, her Egyptian slave, and gave her to her husband Abram as a wife for him. This happened after Abram had lived in the land of Canaan 10 years. He slept with Hagar, and she became pregnant. And when she realized that she was pregnant, she looked down on her mistress. Then Sarai said to Abram, "You are responsible for my suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and ever since she saw that she was pregnant, she has looked down on me. May the Lord judge between you and me." Abram replied to Sarai, "Here, your slave is in your hands. Do whatever you want with her." Then Sarai mistreated her so much that she ran away from her. So here, Abram and Sarai try and take matters into their own hands, and it causes some struggle in the household because back then, at least, if you couldn't have children, you were really looked down upon. Like God must have not liked you for whatever reason. Um, and then if you were having children, you were better than the women that weren't for some odd reason. Granted, children are always great, and procreating is a good thing, but
Yeah, it doesn't always work that way.
yeah, no. But that's how they felt about it. So um, Ishmael is born. He's not the promised son, and God later on tells him, this isn't the promised son. Sarah's going to have a kid, trust me. Um, then the covenant of circumcision is given, which is not a word I like to hear, but
Is that true? That's what they chose to do? Circumcision instead of sacrificing?
um, trying to think. I mean, circumcision, let's see. I think circumcision is just like a showing, kind of like baptism is a showing of our faith. Circumcision was a showing of their faith. Of course, they would circumcise their children at 8 days old, or at least
Yeah.
the boys. Um, whereas baptism, I think we should wait until the children are old enough and they understand why they need to be baptized. And,
Yeah.
So
I think that was the choice that was given in replacing the sacrificing the firstborn. So that they chose chosen to circumcise them instead. At least with the boys.
Yeah, no, with the firstborn, so later on in the law of Moses, God talks about sacrificing the best of the animals, the best of the crops. And then for the firstborn sons, instead of sacrificing the son because God doesn't like human death, he says you can redeem them with an animal.
Okay.
And normally it's a lamb, I think 1 year old or younger, spotless, clean, which is a reflection of Christ, who was the Lamb of God, who was spotless and pure and all that. So that's where that comes in with not sacrificing our firstborn children, which is a good thing.
Yeah.
So there we go. So I'm going to say the Trinity and the evilness of sin. Now Abraham had, so it was right here with the covenant of circumcision, I think. Yeah, that's where Abraham's name got changed to Abraham. So Abraham has some visitors. He's laying in the front of his tent and he sees these three men walk up. It's pretty well understood that this is Yahweh and then two angels with him that are in human form. And Abraham sees them and he gets up and he says, okay, why don't you wait here, wait under the tree. I'll bring some water and some food. And they say, yeah, go ahead and do that. And they sit and they talk. I was wondering, I talked to my dad, he hasn't gotten back to me. But it says they said, go do as you said, which I kind of question why angels would talk with Yahweh as one person. So I wonder if maybe there were actually 5 people, and the 3 were Yahweh, and then the 2 angels are mentioned later, or maybe the 2 angels came later. That's just my thought. I can't really substantiate it right now. But there is a Trinity part in chapter 19 that I will get to. So Abraham shows them hospitality, and Yahweh tells Abraham what he's going to do to Sodom and Gomorrah. And Abraham, knowing that Lot is in Sodom, he says, well, are you going to destroy the righteous with the wicked? What if there are 50 righteous people? You might start higher than that, but God says if there's 50 righteous, I won't do it. And he goes down, he says a few more numbers. Eventually he gets to 10 righteous people, and he says, if there's 10, I won't destroy the cities. And then the angels go to Sodom, and we have, um, okay, so they go to the city square area, and Lot finds them and invites them to his house because they shouldn't sleep in the city square because it's an evil place. Um, and then the men of Sodom go to Lot's house, which is going to be coming up here in a little bit. And actually, I'll go to that slide now. So they go to his house and they want to have relations with him. Read these. So chapter 19, verse 5. So this is the men of the city. They called out to Lot and said, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Send them out to us so we can have sex with them." And then verses 9 through 11. These are the men, again, of the city. "Get out of the way," they said, adding, "This one came here as a foreigner, but he's acting like a judge. Now we'll do more harm to you than to them." So they weren't just going to have sex with the angels, they were going to try and harm them. Um, they put pressure on Lot and came up to break down the door. But the angels reached out, brought Lot into the house with them, and shut the door. They struck the men blind who were at the door of the house, both young and old, with a blinding light, so that they were unable to find the door. Now, I looked at an interlinear, which is it has the Hebrew and then it has the English right underneath it. And I looked at some other translations too, and they say in verse 11 that the men, after being blinded, wearied themselves trying to find the door. So that kind of tells me that, these men, even though they were blinded, I would have been like, why am I blind? What's going on? They were still trying to get to the angels, and you know, um, they really, really, really wanted to practice their sin for some reason. I think that says a lot about humans too. I know with my own sins, sometimes I have some clarity. I'm like, I really shouldn't be doing this, but then I keep doing it anyway, and I'm not sure why. Um, I've been working on that, so hopefully it gets fixed.
We all have that.
Yeah. Sometimes we can say no, and other times it's like, why am I still doing this? Tell you. Verse 24 of 19. Okay, so here's where the Trinity really comes into play for me on this section. And I'm going to say Yahweh instead of Lord, just so you know.
Okay.
Because that's, like I told you 2 weeks ago, when it's Lord or God in all caps, it's actually Yahweh. They just don't always translate it that way. So it says, "Then Yahweh rained burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from Yahweh out of the sky." And so the reason why I say this is the Trinity is because we have Yahweh in human form, probably still in the area where Abraham was, standing there and calling down fire and brimstone from Yahweh in heaven. So Yahweh's in two places. So two things that says that God is omnipresent, present everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
But it also seems that there's at least two persons that are Yahweh. So let me move on. So after all this happens, Lot and his two daughters end up getting away. Their fiancés don't come with them because they thought that Lot was kidding. And then their mom was going with them, but then turned around and looked and became a pillar of salt. So we have that little story, which is that last half of 19, which I'm not going to go over, but just thought I'd bring it up. Okay, so then we have the birth of Isaac. This is where Sarah's name gets changed from Sarai to Sarah. She laughed when she heard about having a child because she was rather old. But she did finally conceive a child, and when Abraham was 100 years old, Isaac was born. Could you imagine being a 100-year-old parent?
And having a newborn?
Yeah. Okay, it's not a grandbaby I can give back to the kids. There were some more problems because Hagar and Ishmael were still in the house. Ishmael was the older son, but Isaac was the promised son who was going to get everything. So I could see some strife there. This is where Abraham is told to sacrifice Isaac, and he takes everything he needs except for the animal, because it's going to be Isaac, not an animal. And they have some servants with them. They go around, and after a while, Abraham says, "Okay, we're going to be right over there, so stop here. We're going to go on." Isaac, fairly smart, he looked around. Like, Dad, we got everything, but where's the animal? And Abraham just says, "Lord, the Lord will provide. It'll be okay." Um, and then they get to the altar. I'm not sure if maybe they built an altar or maybe there's one already there. I'm not really sure. But they get there and they build up the sticks for the fire. And then for some reason, Isaac is fine laying down and getting tied up. But they get there and Abraham pulls out the knife and he raises it and he starts to bring it down. And then God calls out and says, "Stop. Now I know that you're going to do what I want you to do. Look over there." And Abraham looks at the thicket and there's a ram stuck, got his horn stuck in the thicket. And so he unties Isaac and they go get the ram, slaughter it, and sacrifice it. I think that's, yep. So from there, there's not a whole, I don't think there's really a whole lot in the story that pertains to, there's not much in the story after that, actually. So we move on, and Isaac gets a wife, Rebecca, who is, I think she would have been his first or second cousin. I'm not entirely certain, but she was a descendant of Abraham's brother. I do know that. So definitely a cousin or a second cousin.
They have family members as relatives
As
as
spouses. Yeah.
Yeah.
So a lot of people, that's why they think it's allegorical, maybe, or well, there's other things too, but that's probably one of them. Um, but from a young Earth perspective, Adam and Eve were genetically perfect, and then after the curse, that's when the mutations would start adding up. And even at this time with Abraham and Isaac, the genetic mutations wouldn't have been enough for close relatives to have birth defects on their babies. Whereas today, um, I think definitely first cousins and possibly second cousins can still have some birth defects because they're probably going to have the same mutation that's harmful.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then of course, there wasn't a law yet saying that you couldn't marry a close relative. That comes later with Moses. So, I, even though I'm a little weirded out, I would never marry a cousin or my sister or,
Yeah.
I don't have a problem with them doing it just because I can understand genetically it's fine, legally it's fine.
It's a different time.
Yeah. And, there are some monarchies even back in the 16, 1700s, I think, that they would have to marry a cousin or an aunt or because they had to marry royalty and the only royalty was them.
Mm-hmm. His family member.
Yeah. And so there weren't really birth defects necessarily until after a few generations maybe, but there were definitely some features that like, oh yeah, he's a king so and so because that big old nose he's got or whatever. So, um, so what can we learn from this section? I want to try and do some of these to break it up a little bit more. So the first thing, if God makes a promise to you, don't try and fulfill it yourself. Let him do what he's doing and just live your life how you're living it. Otherwise, you're going to cause some trouble, like with Hagar and Sarai, and then Ishmael and Isaac. Be humble and hospitable to everyone you meet, because as Hebrews 13:2 says, you might entertain angels unaware, which that verse is pointing back to this. So, God is also a just God. He didn't destroy the righteous with the wicked. Not that Lot was perfect, but he definitely was not doing what everyone else is doing, and he still trusted Yahweh, which is the main thing for Judaism and Christianity. You have to trust in Yahweh.
Mm-hmm.
And also that man is stubborn in his sin, that they wearied themselves out looking for the door, even though they were blinded by a miracle. And I don't talk about it too much. I do have an experience where I was actually blinded for a little bit. like 30 seconds. It wasn't very long, but that's why I can only imagine that if I had been in that group of men, I think I would have stopped and been like, okay, what's going on, instead of looking for the door.
Mhm.
But I could be wrong, but a different time, different person, right?
Yeah.
So, um, and even when it doesn't make sense, trust God. Sacrificing Isaac, like, hey, he's the son you promised, and he's my heir, but okay.
And you want him to be no more.
Yeah. So, of course, if you're hearing things, you might want to make sure it's God first. Um, I don't think God would ever, even though he asked Abram to do it, or Abraham to do it, I don't think he would tell anyone else to do it. You know, I think it's probably been a while, but that lady that killed her children and said somebody told her to, maybe she said the devil did it, but I don't know. Okay, and then God always makes good on his promises. He gave him Isaac, and he saved Isaac. So now Abram had Sarah and Hagar as wives, and he had a couple other wives too after Sarah died, I believe. Isaac, as far as we know, only had Rebekah as a wife. And then they had twins. I don't think they had any other children, but they had twins. Um, one of them was a rather hairy, man's man that hunts and does all this stuff and had red hair and yeah. And the other one was more fair-skinned and a bit of a mama's boy. Um, and he kind of stayed home and he did the cooking and whatnot. So Esau was the hairy man's man, and Jacob was the fair mama's boy. And they both had their flaws. You mentioned earlier that Jacob was the liar, and yeah, he would deceive and he was very cunning in what he did. Esau, though, cared more about himself. He sold his birthright because even though they were twins, Esau was technically the oldest because he came out first. Um, and he sold his birthright for a bowl of soup. Maybe he thought he was joking, but Jacob didn't think he was, or I don't know, but he still did it. Um, but then Jacob, along with Rebekah, because Rebekah liked Jacob and Isaac liked Esau. Um, but when Isaac is old and he can't really see anymore, um, he told Esau to go and hunt some wild game and make him some food because he really likes the wild game that Esau catches and makes. And so Esau goes out and does that. Well, Rebekah says to Jacob, go get some goats and we'll skin them and we'll cook them up a very similar way, and I know your dad will like it. And then you'll go in and you'll get the blessing that Isaac, I keep on switching them, that Isaac has promised Esau. Of course, Jacob's like, well, I'm not as hairy as my brother, and well, here, put the goat skins on, and it works. I mean, Jacob goes up and he says, here's your food, father, and Isaac's like, well, that was kind of quick, but okay. And he starts eating, and it tastes really good. Jacob had one of Esau's cloaks on, so he could kind of smell like him. And Isaac even said, you sound like Jacob, but you smell and feel like Esau because he was filling his hands and whatnot. And so Isaac eats and then gives Jacob the blessing, thinking it's Esau. Esau finds out and says, well, can't you bless me too? And like, I only have the one blessing to give. I don't know why he only had one blessing, but he did. Um, and so Esau is understandably upset, and Jacob kind of runs away, and he was told to go get a wife from the family. Again, another family member, probably a second or third cousin this time, hopefully. Um, then Esau, he hears that he was told to go get a wife from the family, and so he actually goes and gets a wife from like the Midianites and another group that's in the area that his parents don't like either one. Yeah. So Jacob runs off. Um, there's an artistic depiction of the stairway to heaven because he did sleep for a while on a rock and he did see angels going up and down on either a ladder or a stairway or something of that nature. And he builds an altar to God there and worships. And, eventually, he gets to the family, and there's two sisters. You got Leah, the older sister, and Rachel, the younger sister. Well, Leah is described as kind of plain and is it doe-eyed? her eyes aren't very bright, they're kind of dim. But Rachel is described as amazingly beautiful and bright-eyed and everything that Leah's not, basically. So Jacob loves Rachel, and he talks to their father Laban, or Laban, Laban, and says, I'll work for Rachel. And they decide on 7 years. Like, okay. So he works for 7 years, and it's like nothing because he loves Rachel so much and he's looking forward to being with her. But after the 7 years, they give him Leah, and he doesn't realize it until the next morning. I guess he partied a little too hard during the wedding or something. Of course, he's mad because the agreement was for Rachel. But they said, well, it's not our custom to marry off the younger before the older daughter. And so he says, okay, fine, I'll work another 7 years for Rachel. Like, okay. So he works for 14 years, and then he gets Leah and Rachel. And then Leah and Rachel each have a maid, a handmaiden, however you want to put that. And eventually those two also become his wife because, again, it's the war of the children. Leah ends up having several children. I've got a chart here that talks about the family. And so Rachel gives her handmaiden to him to have children. And then Leah stops having children, so she gives her handmaiden to him to have children. And then Rachel finally has a child or two. And
It's a big mess.
yeah. So eventually Jacob does return with his family and his herds because God did bless him, and his father-in-law Laban was more of a liar and deceiver than Jacob was. And so he kept trying to change Jacob's wages and whatnot, but God blessed Jacob and he got really big flux with it. So eventually he returns to the land of Canaan, which is where Esau is. And he's kind of afraid of meeting up with Esau just because of all that went on. But Esau hears he's coming and he loves him and he's glad to see him. And so everything's good. So here's that chart of the family. Can you read the sons pretty well? Or is it small? I can't quite tell. I can read it pretty well here.
Sons are below.
Yeah, down at the bottom there.
Yeah.
Okay. So you can see on the left, you've got Leah and her servant Zilpah. And then you've got Rachel and Bilhah on the right. So Leah had 6 sons: Reuben, Simon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. Zilpah had Gad and Asher. Rachel has Joseph, and then Benjamin is the last one. He comes quite a while after the other ones. And then Bilhah has Dan and Naphtali.
So Benjamin would be after Benjamin be after Joseph gets sold to the Egyptians?
Yeah. After he gets sold and Joseph thinks or not Joseph, Jacob thinks that Joseph is dead, then Rachel has another son, Benjamin. And Benjamin actually ends up, well, I don't want to say that Benjamin killed his mom, but during childbirth, Rachel dies. So, that's one of those things where it's kind of like, you killed your mother.
Yeah.
But it wasn't his fault.
That's why a lot of people use that as an excuse when that happens.
Yeah. So, so these 12 become the 12 tribes eventually. They're kind of the heads of the households, and there is one daughter. I'm not sure. Her name was Delilah. Was it Delilah?
That's who it is. It's my red one.
Yeah. I should have looked this up. Dinah. D-I-N-A-H. Dinah. Delilah is the woman that took down Samson. So, I'm not sure which. Oh, it says right there. Leah. Leah had a daughter. So, anyway. So Joseph is the favored son. That's why he has the coat of many colors in that picture there, which he really had in real life too.
Okay.
And like I said, Benjamin wasn't born yet, so the other 10 brothers were jealous of Joseph. And then Joseph has the dreams. He has him and his brothers are out. They're getting the sheaves of grain in the field, and their sheaves of grain bow down in front of his sheaf of grain, and he tells them this, and they're like, "Are we going to bow down to you?" And then he has one with not only the stars, but also the moon and the sun, and those represent the moon and sun represent his father and mother, and so and they get, the brothers get really mad at him, and they were going to kill him. They decide to sell him into slavery. They take his coat and they rip it up and they put some lamb's blood on it, and they convince Jacob that Joseph, his beloved son, is dead. So we got Joseph in Egypt. Joseph is sold into slavery. He ends up being bought by Potiphar, and he does really well in Potiphar's household. He's second only to Potiphar in that household after a while.
So he's the Pharaoh, right?
He's not the Pharaoh, but he's one of the Pharaoh's advisors.
Okay.
He's kind of high up there. Now Potiphar's wife likes Joseph. He's kind of handsome, and she wants to sleep with him, but he doesn't want to mess up the relationship he has with his master. He doesn't want to dishonor his master. There we go. But eventually, him and her are in the house alone, and she grabs him by his cloak, and he runs off, leaving his cloak behind him. And then she has the cloak and says, "See what that slave of yours tried to do?" Of course, he didn't try to do anything, but so he gets thrown in jail, and it's the high-end jail for Pharaoh's people, but Potiphar gets to use it because he's kind of high up too. So Joseph meets the cupbearer and the baker for Pharaoh, the royal cupbearer and royal baker, and they have some dreams. Joseph interprets them, and they're both kind of similar. In 3 days, the cupbearer will have his position restored, and then in 3 days, the baker is going to have his head cut off. So they're similar but different. And Joseph just says, remember me when this happens, to the cupbearer. The baker wouldn't really matter. So it happens as he predicts. The cupbearer, though, forgets about Joseph for a couple more years, and Joseph stays in jail for a couple more years. Then Pharaoh has a couple dreams, and he's disturbed by them. He tells his advisors about them, but they can't interpret it. Even the people that are supposed to be interpreting dreams are like, we don't know. Then the cupbearer is like, oh, there's a guy in prison that interpreted my dream, and it was right. And he interpreted the baker's dream, and it was right too. So they call Joseph, and he interprets the dreams. So the two dreams, first we have these fat, healthy cattle that come up out of the Nile, and there's 7 of them. And then we have 7 scrawny, sickly cattle that come up out of the Nile, and they actually eat the fat, healthy cattle, but they still stay scrawny and ugly and sickly. And then we have 7 heads of grain that pop up, and they're healthy and plump and whatnot. And then we have 7 more heads of grain that are also sickly and unhealthy, and they pop up and devour the healthy ones, but they stay sickly and unhealthy. So this is the 7 years of plenty, followed by the 7 years of famine. And Pharaoh says, okay, who can we get to prepare us for this? And he says, well, you interpreted it. How about God is obviously with you. Your God is anyway, and so why don't you tell us what to do? And so Joseph gets really high up. He stores the grain for the 7 years. Give us a tenth of the. I think he says a tenth. Bring us a tenth of the grain every year, and we'll store it up. And then during the 7 years of famine, they start selling it back to the people. Eventually, it's just for money, but then they run out of money, so then they sell their land. Then they sell themselves. So Pharaoh gets all this money and power. The Egyptian priests still kept their temples and their money because they're priests. They have a privileged position. But then the famine also hits Canaan, and Jacob sends his sons to get some food. Well, they end up in front of Joseph, but they don't know it's Joseph because it's been, it's been at least a decade or more since they've seen him, and they thought that he was probably dead or working or whatever. They didn't expect him to be viceroy to the Pharaoh. Plus, he doesn't look like a Hebrew. Well, facially he might have, but he probably had like an Egyptian hairstyle and probably didn't have a beard. And so he sells them grain, and then they go back, and he wants them to. They didn't bring Benjamin. Benjamin had been born, but they didn't bring Benjamin because Joseph, that's his last son from his favorite wife who's now dead and can't have more children. So he wants to protect Benjamin. But Joseph asks about him. Come to think, but maybe Benjamin I want to say Joseph knew about Benjamin before he was sold, but maybe he didn't, because he does ask, if they have any other brothers, and is their father still alive? And they answer him not knowing it's Joseph. They just think he's asking. But so he says, next time you come back, bring your brother, or I'm not going to see you. And so after a long discussion and after the grain is gone, they finally convince Jacob to let them take Benjamin with them, and they go back, and then they get more grain and they start heading back. But Joseph had put his silver cup into Benjamin's bag, along with all the money. He did that the first time too. He gave him all the money back, not the cup thing, but he gave them all their money back. Um, and they were worried about getting thrown in jail for that. They didn't. But then Joseph sends his people after them to go get the cup back, and they bring him back, and they're like, don't keep him, keep me, let him go back, otherwise our dad's going to die of grief. And finally Joseph can't handle it anymore, and he's bawling, and he says, I'm Joseph, your brother, and he's speaking in Hebrew now because he was speaking in Egyptian through an interpreter to keep his act up. But now he's speaking in Hebrew, and they're like, we're going to die. But he loves them. And there's those two pictures. I need to move through these a little faster. But there's the two pictures. The first one on the left showing that the first time where they didn't know it was him. Then the one on the right is where he reveals himself to them. So they bring everybody in. Jacob and the whole family, like 70 plus people. And they move into the land of Goshen. And they're herders, and the Egyptians don't really like herders and shepherds that much, but they let them stay in Goshen where it's nice and water. That's up near the Nile Delta towards the Mediterranean Sea. It's in that area. And eventually, Jacob is getting ready to die, and he starts blessing his children. He blesses the sons of Joseph, but he gives the younger one the blessing over the older one on purpose.
Now, his arms over the.
Yeah, so his arms are crossed.
The top one is the stronger one, more powerful.
Probably, yeah. Something along those lines. So, now Joseph's two sons actually take Joseph's place and Levi's place as far as tribe members are concerned. The Levites become priests. They don't have an inheritance. They have some cities in the different tribal areas, but they don't have their own area per se. Their inheritance is being a priest to Yahweh. So technically there's 13 tribes of Israel, but there's only supposed to be 12. I don't know. It's funny how it works sometimes. So.
Does that way have 13 is a lucky number? Supposedly a lucky number for them?
Maybe. I don't know. I'll have to look into that. So. Now there is. I watched a documentary called Patterns of Evidence Exodus. Last I knew it was on Netflix. It talks about some stuff that they found in that area, the land of Goshen. And one of them, there's these 12 main tombs that would represent the 12 heads of Israel, right? One of them, though, is a pyramid tomb with a statue in it, which is the computer-generated picture there. The statue does have a little bit of paint left of multicolored coats, and it does look like someone from Canaan would have looked like, not an Egyptian, but someone from the north.
Okay.
And so there's this idea that this is kind of evidence that the Israelites really were in Egypt, and that that they did have the Exodus and all that stuff. Of course, there's some debate around this because it wants to move everything in the timeline of Egypt and some other things back a few hundred years, which watching the video, I think makes a lot of sense. Because there is a lot of evidence for them being around at that time and going into Canaan when they did, and that kind of thing. So there is some debate around it. I'm going to look more into it, but I think it's a good documentary. If nothing else, at least you'll have some information.
Yeah.
So, okay, so what can we learn from Joseph's story? And we're almost done, just a couple more slides. So first of all, playing favorites makes a dysfunctional family, although I guess it happens anyway. Even in the darkest of places, God is there helping us get through it. When he was in the pit and when he got sold into slavery and then he was in jail, but God was still with him. He didn't give up. There's nothing in the story where Joseph is like, why? Unlike other people in the Bible. So God does know And sometimes will reveal the future to people, even to people that aren't part of his chosen people. Pharaoh wasn't part of God's chosen people, but he revealed to him what was going to happen. The same thing with Nebuchadnezzar, centuries later, the king of Babylon. He reveals some things to him that Daniel, a Hebrew, interprets for him. So God, whether he does it to his people or other people, he uses that for his own glory, and to take care of anyone who will listen. So, which Pharaoh listened. If Pharaoh hadn't listened, then Egypt probably wouldn't be very well known today, I wouldn't think. They probably would have died.
Been found in there as well.
Yeah. Well, that's where the famine started, and then it spread out. But he listened to Joseph, and Joseph was able to prepare for those 7 years. They held back grain, and the next 7 years they gave it out again. So, the last thing is that people change, and forgiveness is really for our benefit, not theirs. I forgive people pretty easily because otherwise I'm carrying a grudge and it's toxic. Whereas if I forgive them, I don't necessarily forget what they did. I may not trust them in that area for a while, but I've still forgiven them, and I can at least try and build that relationship back, and it's a lot more healthy.
Yeah.
It's that's why Joseph only hung on for so long, and then he broke down bawling because he couldn't take it anymore. So, and he forgave them. So that's the end of that. Next time, which is going to be July 5th, which is 2 weeks from today, I believe.
Yeah. That one I'm not sure I'm going to make because I'm going to be coming back from, I'm going to a friend's cabin.
Okay.
And I actually come back on that day, so I'm not sure what time we're getting back.
That's okay. If you want, I'll be live streaming. Hopefully this live stream worked out. If anything, I'll be recording it again and putting it on YouTube so you could watch it if you want.
Okay, cool.
But we are going to go over Exodus, the entire book of Exodus. I'll be doing like I did here. I'll be jumping, several chapters ahead every now and again. So I think, if you want to read, I could get the verses that Jason McBride gave me, because he gave me a list of redemptive story verses, and I'm kind of basing my talk off of those.
Okay.
Not strictly, but that's kind of like, okay, here's the foundation, and I build up.
Yeah.
So I could at least give you those foundation verses, and you could read those if you want, and maybe have some questions. That's up to you.
Yeah.
I'll email that to you.
Okay.
So that's what we're going to go over that time.
Cool.
Are there any questions right now, or?
No, I think I kind of asked them and you answered.
Okay. Then